Well, welcome to another episode of the SALLT Leadership Podcast, the show for leaders who want to live a purposeful life, grow in their faith, and maximize their abilities and influence for the kingdom of God. I'm Wes Lane. For today's episode, we'll be exploring the power of God and what that means for you as a kingdom leader, as someone who has access to God's strength and God's resources. Now, first of all, let me just say this. I am a fellow traveler just like you. My credentials, if you will, are simply just years on the journey and discovering that God is a rewarder of those who diligently seek Him. So I got to start off with a story. So years ago, years ago, I don't even remember how many years ago, 20, 30 years, I don't know, it's way back. So anyway, I'm at this deal, and a pastor from Africa is speaking to this group. And it's an incredible story. In fact, this is why they brought him over, was he just had this incredible story of in the village he was in, praying for people getting healed right and left, all of this breakout of the miraculous. And so he's back here and he's telling the story, and obviously he had not been told that God doesn't do much these days, because he's knocking it out of the park over there in Africa, and so he has clearly discovered that God has not changed, and it's really when I was listening to him, I was just stunned, and I managed to take that man to lunch, and so of course the question I had on my mind was this. I said, well, what happened that launched you suddenly, into just praying for people and all this? And he looked at me and he just said this, and his accent was so thick, I almost couldn't understand it. But he said, well, I read the first 6 chapters of Mark and thought I'd give it a try. I'm like, the chills ran up and down my core. The thought of winging God like that absolutely blew my mind. But that's exactly what he did. He'd not been to seminary. He'd not done all this stuff. He did what the apostles did. They watched the first 6 chapters of Mark by watching Jesus, and then they winged God just like he did. And so it really pointed out my puny faith in that era, in that period of what God did these days. And of course, when I just kept seeing this time and time again, I realized I've been hanging with the wrong people. I started realizing that, my golly, if I keep hanging with friends who tell me God doesn't do this and God doesn't do that, well, then okay, I'm gonna be hanging with my friends. That's the culture I live in. But then I started getting introduced to these people who were living in a whole different culture that wasn't supposed to be happening. And then I start seeing this with my own eyeballs and participating in it. Then I realized, okay, I think I'm going to stop telling God what He doesn't do these days, and I'm just going to say, Lord, I want you to do whatever you want, and I love that. Have you ever felt that you've suffered from a bad case of low expectations? Well, that's just really common. Do you find yourself confronted by what's before you and have a hard time believing that God is going to be big enough to handle that something? Remember, if we're willing, life with God is a big adventure, and we are on a lifelong journey of discovery. And so why say if we're willing? Well, it's because, quite honestly, just not everybody looks at it like that. Let me quickly share 2 experiences that were life-changing for me and set me on a course for discovery. And again, I share this with you because I want to encourage you. I realized how important it is for people to share their experiences, because that it just starts unlocking the prison cells of this less than experience that so many. Remember, we're sent to set the captives free. You can't set anybody free if you can't get free yourself. And so think about these. In fact, I encourage you to look around, to start listening for the stories of other people, because and sometimes you just got to ask God to help you. In James 4:2 it says, you have not because you don't ask. You don't have because you don't ask. So ask Him. Matthew 19, 22 or 19:26, Jesus looked at them and said, "With God, this is impossible, but with with man, forgive me. With man, this is impossible, but with God, all things are possible." And then Malachi 3:6, "For I, the Lord, do not change." And A.W. Tozer said this, and boy, hang your hat on this one too. This is a big thing to think about. What you think about God is the most important thing about you. What you think about God is the most important thing about you. Why? Because it will determine what you're willing to do and how you're able to go up against problems. So my first experience with George Mueller, and I've shared I've not shared all about him other than to say this. So George Mueller very quickly was a 20-something-year-old kid in the early 19th century, and he's bugged about something. The burden on his heart is quite simply this: people just don't believe God these days. Does that sound familiar? It's like 1836, and he's making this comment. And so people don't believe God, and so he decided, I'm just going to prove God. And the way I'm going to do that is that I'm going to raise orphans. I'm going to build orphanages, and I'm going to do all these things, and I'm not going to ask anybody for one dime. And didn't. So throughout the 60 years of his life, he built 5 orphanages, fed, clothed, and housed thousands of children in an era that was not fashionable, quite honestly, but that's another story. And supported ministries around the world. At the time of he kept meticulous records because he never asked anyone for money. His staff was never allowed to ask anyone for money. The only thing they would do was to send out an annual report to say, here's the money we got, here's how we spent it. But what he never told anybody was, this is what we need. There were no get-togethers like, hey, brother, can I get together and have a chat with you about the ministry? There was nothing like that. And yet, over 60 years of his life, and this is so well documented, it gave goosebumps to my lawyerliness, wanting to show me the evidence. Over his 60-plus years of life, God provided over $200 million. $200 million. So, and yet at times he said this. He said, if it's not been 500, it's been 1,000 times that we haven't known where the next shilling is, if this was in England, where the next shilling is coming from, because God trained him, put him through a weight room, and taught him that he will always be faithful. So the second thing that blew my mind, which was really life-changing, was because God showed up in my personal marketplace. And my marketplace, 25 plus years ago, was a courtroom. It was a murder trial. And in fact, the murder trial surrounded a missing 12-year-old girl. When she had been found in she had never been found. When her blood pool was found in an apartment in South Oklahoma City, and there was just a blood pool, maybe 5 or 6 inches wide. It was not enough for a cup of blood. It wasn't enough for a fatal amount. And that child, there were no other blood drips. There was nothing. It's as if this child was in a Star Trek episode and had been beamed up to the ship because there was no evidence. In fact, there wasn't a stitch of clothing that was even missing. It was a complete mystery about what had happened. But in the end, I mean, it was such a hard case because there were crystal sightings, Frontier City, the local amusement park, there or other places in which they'd say, well, we saw crystal here and we saw crystal there, but we knew she was dead. We could tell she was dead. There were circumstances around this, and I don't have time to go into it. It's a fascinating story, but there were circumstances around it that we knew she was dead. We also knew that it was her stepfather that had killed her and had hidden the body. So I filed charges. And so that became one of the most stressful periods of my life. In fact, you couldn't go anywhere in this city, or let's put it this way, you couldn't go to a gas pump and put gas in your car in that era without seeing her picture and a phone number to call if you see her. It was impossible. It was everywhere. The stress from that was incredible. It was the first time my wife and I started praying together. I was praying. First time I started reading the Psalms, I realized that the Psalms were cries to God from David, a man desperate for him and needing his help, and I needed his help. And so I started crying out to God. I would pray the Psalms, find a just cause, O God, attend unto my cry. You despise bloodthirsty and wicked men, blah, 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 all of this sort of stuff. And so finally, my wife goes to, so here's the thing here's the thing that dropped my jaw. Lori, and I were the only two knowing that we were praying like that. This wasn't like a club or anything. It was just her and I on the floor, on our face, in our bedroom, crying out to God. Nobody knew we were doing that. Lori goes to a Bible study, to a place. She didn't know anybody except the person that brings her. She shows up. The woman who she doesn't know, who's leading it, comes up to her and says this, Lori, the matter about which you and your husband have been praying is a just cause. Now, folks, that almost makes me weepy here even to remember that. No, that was impossible to happen. I realized that God heard my cry and was telling me, you were right on. Keep going. And I saw God show up in the middle. I've written about this. I'm not going to go into it. We just don't have time. But I saw God show up in miraculous ways in a jury trial, in a murder trial, do things that I know we would not have been able to pull off. And I learned a lesson from that, and that God is in my marketplace. So whether you're a homemaker, whether you're a business person, whether you're a school teacher, or whatever you do, whether you mow lawns, whether you are, whatever you do, you have got to realize that the living God has sent you to that, and that He is there with you. A supernatural God is bringing all of Him into that moment, and He will be everything you need to be successful. And by the way, we won that jury trial, much to the shock in the courthouse, because here's what you got to remember. If you limit the expectations of the power of God, you will never be disappointed. Let me repeat that. Let me be really clear on that. If you limit what you think God will do, well, of course, you'll never be disappointed, because you'll never have any expectations. Because faith is spelled R-I-S-K, risk. You've got to get out of the boat. You've got to life with God is sometimes not sometimes, it is all the time just taking the next step into the mist. You are walking in faith, and what He is all about is showing Himself faithful. What you think about God is the most important thing about you, and He loves our audacity. I would rather have a reputation I would rather have a reputation for believing God for too much than too little. Think about that. You should too. We should be His audacious kids. When He sees us, he ought to get a twinkle in his eye because we dare to believe Him. And let me tell you something, in a world like today, we need to be like that. Well, so if you're thinking, so what do I do with all that? Well, or maybe you're thinking, well, if this is true, how do I get unstuck from my stinking thinking? Well, here's some action steps. First of all, you got to do this. You got to ask God to help you. You got to just ask Him. Or even if you're struggling a little bit, I heard someone once say this. Just tell Him you're willing to be willing. Just give Him a green light. Give Him an opening. And I say that because He's just not going to make you go someplace with Him. So, and stir the embers of your faith. This is a really important thing. I can't I can't tell you, I can't underscore this enough, how important stirring the embers of your faith is. And so because Romans 12:3 says, God has given each of us some measure of faith. Think about this. If you're a follower of Jesus, that required a leap of faith right there. So you have a measure of faith. So stir that up. Consider those as embers. Paul told Timothy, I don't remember in the book of Timothy, he told Timothy, stir the embers of the gifting that you have been given. These are things you blow on these embers. And so you're not starting with zero. Step out. Start immersing yourself in the stories of other people. One time we read God's Smuggler by Brother Andrew in our staff, or we read the story of George Mueller. We read these stories contemporaneous or before of these lives of men and women who are experiencing what is the normal life with God, which is a supernatural life. Life with God is not natural. It is beyond that. It is supernatural. People get all, if you want to get all jammed up about that, then fine, go get jammed up. But I'm just telling you, God is not like you and me. He is beyond that. But we're made in his image. And he loves us with a fury. And he loves it when we put him on display. And he will not go on display if we are not willing. So he will reward you. He is the faithful one who does that. So what's the point of all that? I mean, look at it this way. The Bible says, if you will endure, you will yet reign with him, with Jesus. So think about it this way. You're training for reigning. Someday, there will be a point in time in which you and I will actually be reigning with God. So just look at this time right now. This is all training for reigning. And so you can do this. In fact, keep this in mind. 1 Chronicles 16:9. I love this. For the eyes of the Lord search to and fro throughout the earth, that he might strongly support those whose hearts are completely his. He is in this with you, and he is the willing one. So imagine a city in which it was commonplace for every follower of Jesus to believe God for impossible things. Wow. So, as always, I want to end our time together by reminding you of this. And folks, this is what culls you from the herd. You have been designed, built by a living God, sent into this moment of history, to the community to which you live as part of God's overarching strategy to redeem and restore the earth to himself. Your life is purposeful. It matters. And God has a vested interest in seeing you accomplish your life mission successfully. You can do this. Rise up. I'll see you next time.